A lonely girl helped a lost stranger with Alzheimer while everyone watched in fear. When the black SUV arrived the next morning, her mother couldn't believe what the man inside revealed. Sophie sat on Mrs. Thompson's front porch, her small legs dangling from the wooden bench. The late afternoon sun beat down on the quiet street where other kids played, their laughter floating through the warm air. Her backpack lay beside her, stuffed with homework she hadn't touched yet. "Would you like some lemonade, dear?" Mrs. Thompson called from inside the house. The old woman's voice carried the same gentle tone it always did. "No, thank you," Sophie replied, her eyes fixed on a group of children playing hopscotch across the street. She recognized them from school: Sarah, Emma, and Katie from Ms. Martinez's class. They hadn't invited her to play today. They never did. The screen door creaked open behind her. Mrs. Thompson emerged, wiping her hands on her floral apron. "Are you sure? It's awfully hot out here." Sophie shook her head, her dark curls bouncing slightly. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller on the bench. The memory of yesterday's class presentation crept into her mind, making her stomach twist. "Can you tell me what's bothering you?" Mrs. Thompson settled next to her on the bench, the wood creaking under their combined weight. Sophie's fingers traced a pattern on her pink sweatshirt. "The substitute teacher yesterday," she started, then stopped. Her throat felt tight. "What about her?" Mrs. Thompson's voice was soft, patient. "She skipped me during show and tell." Sophie's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I had my hand up the whole time. She called on everyone else." Everyone. Her last word carried the weight of understanding that was too heavy for her 7 years. Mrs. Thompson's hand found Sophie's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Did you tell your mother?" Sophie shook her head again. "She's too busy. The principal asked her to work on a special project at school." Her voice trembled slightly. "She told me this morning I'll have to stay here longer every day now." Across the street, Sarah's mother had arrived to pick her up. Sophie watched as the woman wrapped her daughter in a tight hug, their matching blonde hair catching the sunlight. Sarah's backpack had princess stickers all over it. Sophie's was plain black. They couldn't afford the fancy ones. "Your mother works very hard to give you the best she can," Mrs. Thompson said, following Sophie's gaze. "Just like my Harold did for our children before he passed." Sophie nodded, but her attention had shifted to the empty space in the driveway where her father's car used to park. She barely remembered him now, just a vague shape in photographs and the sound of a door closing for the last time when she was 2. The afternoon stretched on, marked by the steady parade of parents arriving to collect their children. Sophie watched each reunion from her perch on the porch, counting the minutes until her mother would finish her extended day at school. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of Mrs. Thompson's maple tree, carrying with it the first hint of evening. The shadows grew longer across the lawn, and the hopscotch girls had long since gone home. Sophie's homework still waited in her backpack, but she couldn't focus on multiplication tables right now. "Maybe we should go inside," Mrs. Thompson suggested, standing slowly. "I could help you with your homework before dinner." But Sophie didn't move. Her eyes had locked onto something, or someone, across the street. An elderly man stood on the sidewalk, wearing a beige sweater despite the warm weather. He turned in slow circles, looking up and down the street with increasingly frantic movements. "I don't know," he mumbled, loud enough for Sophie to hear. "I don't know where." His words trailed off as he patted his pockets, his weathered hands trembling. Sophie straightened on the bench, her earlier troubles momentarily forgotten. The man's distress was clear in every confused movement, every uncertain step. He reminded her of how she felt in class sometimes, lost, overlooked, trying to find her place. Mrs. Thompson hadn't noticed him yet. She had gone inside to start dinner preparations. The street was oddly empty now. The usual afternoon traffic died down. The man took a few stumbling steps, then stopped again, looking around with increasing panic in his movements. Sophie's mother had always taught her to be kind to elderly people, to help them whenever she could. She thought about how Mrs. Thompson sometimes forgot where she put her glasses, and how scared she looked until Sophie helped her find them. The man's confusion seemed much worse than that. He kept turning in circles, his movements becoming more agitated. "I need to go home," he said to no one in particular, his voice cracking. "I need to go home." Sophie glanced at the screen door, then back at the man. Mrs. Thompson was in the kitchen. She could hear pots clanking. The man looked like he might cry, and something in his lost expression pulled at her heart. She stood up slowly, her small hands smoothing down her jeans, a nervous habit her mother always noticed. The distance between the porch and the sidewalk seemed much longer than usual. Sophie took one step, then another, her heart beating faster with each movement. The man hadn't noticed her yet. He was still turning, still searching, his eyes darting from house to house as if hoping to recognize something familiar. Sophie took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Excuse me," she said softly, taking another step closer. "Are you lost?" The elderly man turned toward her, voice, his movements uncertain. Up close, Sophie could see the tears in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. Something in his gaze reminded her of her own reflection when she felt alone at school, that look of being somewhere familiar yet somehow completely lost. She was about to say something else when she heard Mrs. Thompson's screen door creak open behind her. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the street, and Sophie knew she had to make a choice: retreat to the safety of the porch or help someone who looked as lost as she sometimes felt. The man's eyes met hers, confusion mixing with a glimmer of hope. "I need to go home," he repeated, his voice smaller now. "Can you help me find home?" Sophie took one more step forward, her decision made. She didn't know yet that this choice would change everything. For her, for the man before her, and for the entire neighborhood watching from behind their curtains as a little black girl approached a lost white stranger in the gathering dusk of an ordinary afternoon. "My name is Sophie," she said, keeping her voice steady like her mother had taught her when meeting new people. The man blinked at her, his gray eyebrows furrowing deeper. I need to go home," he repeated, his hands clutching the hem of his beige sweater. "But I can't remember where." Sophie glanced back at Mrs. Thompson's house. The old woman stood in the doorway now, her body tense. "Sophie," she called out, her voice sharp with worry. "Come back inside, honey." But Sophie stayed where she was. The man's eyes were red-rimmed and watery, like he'd been crying. "Maybe we can help you find it," she offered. "What's your address?" He patted his pockets again, more frantically this time. "I had it. I wrote it down. I always write it down." His voice cracked on the last word. Behind her, Sophie heard Mrs. Thompson's steps on the porch stairs. "Young lady, you get back here right this minute." A car drove by slowly, the driver's neck craning to watch the scene. Sophie saw Mrs. Parker from 2 houses down step onto her lawn, phone in hand. More curtains twitched in nearby windows. "It's okay," Sophie said to the man, ignoring the growing attention. "We can ask Mrs. Thompson. She knows everyone in the neighborhood." The man's shoulders slumped. "Everyone keeps saying that. But I don't. I can't." He looked up and down the street again, his breathing getting faster. "None of this looks right." Mrs. Thompson had reached them now, her hand firmly gripping Sophie's shoulder. "Come away from him, child." She turned to the man, keeping Sophie partially behind her. "Sir, are you lost?" "I need to go home," he said again, his voice smaller than before. "Please, I need to go home." More cars were slowing down now. Sophie saw Mr. Jenkins from across the street step onto his porch, arms crossed. 2 women walking their dogs had stopped to stare. The man seemed to shrink under their attention. "Maybe we should call the police," Mrs. Parker called out from her lawn, her phone already raised. The man's eyes widened at the word police. No, I need to go home. Please." His hands trembled harder as he searched his pockets again. Sophie slipped out from behind Mrs. Thompson. "Don't be scared," she said, moving closer to him again. "We'll help you." "Sophie." Mrs. Thompson's voice was sharp with fear now. "Get back here." But Sophie had already reached the man. Up close, she could smell soap and something like her grandfather's old sweater. His eyes weren't scary at all, just confused and afraid, like she felt sometimes when the other kids wouldn't play with her. "Do you remember what your house looks like?" she asked gently. "Is it big or small?" He stared at her for a long moment, his breathing slowing slightly. It's blue, with white shutters. Mary planted roses in the front. But that was... His voice trailed off, confusion clouding his features again. More neighbors had emerged from their houses now. Sophie could hear their murmurs, feel their stares. A police car turned onto their street, moving slowly. "Sophie," Mrs. Thompson said again, her voice trembling slightly. "Please come here." The man noticed the gathering crowd now. His hands started shaking harder. I don't know." I need to go home. It's okay, Sophie said firmly, reaching for his hand like she did when Mrs. Thompson got confused about her glasses. We'll find it together. His large, weathered hand was cold despite the warm day. Sophie held it gently, like she held the baby birds they'd found in the schoolyard last spring. The police car stopped nearby. An officer stepped out, hand resting on his belt. More cars were stopping now. Sophie could hear phones being pulled out, cameras clicking. Step away from the child, sir. The officer called out, walking toward them. The man's grip tightened slightly on Sophie's hand. Not hurting, just holding on like he was afraid to let go. Please, he whispered. I just want to go home. Sophie squared her small shoulders and faced the approaching officer. He's lost, she said clearly. I'm helping him find his home. The officer stopped a few feet away, his expression uncertain. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward. Officer, I'm sorry about this. The child was just trying to help, but wait, a new voice called out. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner house was hurrying toward them. I know him. That's Robert Mitchell. He lives over on Maple Street. His wife Mary passed last year. The man, Mr. Robert, looked up at the name. Mary, he said softly. Mary knows the way home. Sophie squeezed his hand gently. Mrs. Rodriguez knows where you live, Mr. Robert. We can take you there. The officer's stance relaxed slightly, but people were still staring, still filming. Sophie could hear whispers, could see the way some people held their phones up higher to capture the strange scene. A little black girl holding hands with a lost elderly white man while the police and half the neighborhood watched. Maybe we should wait for his family, someone in the crowd suggested. Is it safe? Another voice mumbled. Sophie felt Mr. Robert's hand trembling harder in hers. She looked up at his face and saw tears starting to fall. Without thinking, she stepped closer to him, trying to block his view of the staring crowd. Would you like to hear about my drawing? She asked, remembering how she calmed her little cousin during thunderstorms. I made one in art class today. It's a butterfly garden. Mr. Robert looked down at her, his confused eyes focusing slightly. A garden? Yes, Sophie said, smiling up at him. With lots of flowers. Purple ones, like the ones in Mrs. Thompson's yard. And yellow ones that look like tiny suns. The officer had stepped back, talking quietly into his radio. Mrs. Rodriguez was on her phone, presumably calling Mr. Robert's family. But Sophie kept talking about her drawing, about the colors she'd used and the tiny butterflies she'd added in the corners. Slowly, very slowly, Mr. Robert's trembling began to ease. His grip on her hand loosened slightly, though he didn't let go. Some of the tension left his shoulders as he listened to her steady stream of words. The butterflies in my picture are orange and blue, she continued, ignoring the murmurs around them. My teacher said real butterflies aren't blue, but I told her I saw one in your yard once, Mrs. Thompson. Remember? It was right by your rose bush. Mrs. Thompson's face softened. Yes, dear. I remember that day. More cars were arriving now, but these weren't curious neighbors. A woman jumped out of one before it fully stopped, her face tight with worry. Dad, she called out. Oh, thank God. Mr. Robert turned toward her voice, but his hand stayed in Sophie's. Karen, he said uncertainly. The woman rushed forward, then stopped short when she saw the crowd, the police car, her father holding hands with a small black girl she'd never seen before. Dad, we've been looking everywhere for you. How did you get all the way over here? Sophie felt Mr. Robert's hand tighten again. She squeezed back gently and smiled at the woman. He got lost trying to go home, she explained. But it's okay. We kept each other company while we waited. The woman, Karen, looked at Sophie with an expression the child couldn't quite read. You stayed with him? This whole time? Sophie nodded. He was scared. Sometimes when I'm scared, I just want someone to hold my hand and tell me everything will be okay. The crowd had gone quiet now, watching this new development. Even the police officer had stopped talking into his radio. Karen knelt down in front of Sophie, her eyes filling with tears. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for taking care of my father. Mr. Robert was looking between his daughter and Sophie, confusion still evident in his features but less panic now. She told me about butterflies, he said softly. Blue ones, in a garden. Karen stood up, wiping her eyes. Dad, let's get you home. Mom's waiting. But Mr. Robert didn't move yet. He looked down at Sophie, his weathered face creasing in a small smile. Thank you, he said, the words clear and certain despite his confusion earlier. For helping me find my way home. Sophie smiled back, gently releasing his hand. You're welcome, Mr. Robert. Maybe you can come see Mrs. Thompson's blue butterfly sometime. As Karen led her father to the waiting car, the crowd began to disperse. The police officer tipped his hat and left. Phones disappeared into pockets. But Sophie noticed something different in the neighbors' faces now when they looked at her, something that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Thompson wrapped an arm around Sophie's shoulders. Come on, dear. Let's get you inside. Your mother will be here soon, and you need to finish your homework. Sophie let herself be led back toward the house, but she turned to watch Mr. Robert's car drive away. The setting sun painted the street in shades of orange and purple, like the butterflies in her drawing, like the flowers in Mrs. Thompson's garden, like the colors of a world that sometimes seemed scary but could also be beautiful, if you were brave enough to help someone find their way home. The murmurs started as soon as Mr. Robert's car turned the corner. Sophie could hear them from Mrs. Thompson's porch, where she sat with her untouched homework spread across her lap. Someone could have gotten hurt, Mrs. Parker said loudly to another neighbor. She still clutched her phone, her knuckles white against the pink case. Did you see how he grabbed her hand? Someone else whispered. What if he had tried to dash? That's enough, Mrs. Thompson cut in sharply from beside Sophie. The child did what none of us had the courage to do. More neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. Their phones kept appearing, disappearing, appearing again. Sophie watched them tap at their screens, their heads bent together as they talked in low voices. A police car cruised by again, slower this time. The officer inside wasn't the same one as before. This one stared hard at the house, at Sophie, at the group of neighbors still clustered on the street. Sophie's stomach churned. She'd seen that look before, in stores when she's shopping with her mother, in parks when she played too close to other children, in her classroom when things went missing. Maybe we should go inside, Mrs. Thompson suggested, her hand warm on Sophie's shoulder. But before they could move, a new voice cut through the evening air. What's going on here? Sophie's mother stood at the bottom of the porch steps, still in her teaching clothes, her face tight with worry. I got 3 different messages about police and a strange man. Mama! Sophie jumped up, her homework scattering across the porch. I helped someone today. Mr. Robert was lost in dash. Lost? Her mother climbed the steps quickly, pulling Sophie into a tight hug. Baby, what were you thinking? Approaching a stranger like that. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward. Miss Williams, if I may, your daughter did something extraordinary today. Sophie's mother didn't loosen her hold. What happened? Tell me everything. The story spilled out in pieces, from Mrs. Thompson, from the neighbors who'd stayed, from Sophie herself. With each detail, Sophie felt her mother's arms tighten, then gradually relax. He was crying, Mama, Sophie explained, looking up at her mother's face. Like I did when the substitute teacher wouldn't call on me. He just wanted to go home. Her mother's breath caught. The substitute? What substitute? Before Sophie could answer, a new wave of murmurs swept through the remaining crowd. A black SUV had turned onto their street, moving slowly past the houses. Sophie felt her mother tense again. Mrs. Thompson moved closer to them both. The police car that had been circling reappeared, following the SUV at a distance. The vehicle stopped in front of Mrs. Thompson's house. The neighbors' phones came out again, recording as a man in an expensive suit stepped out. He looked around, his eyes finding Sophie on the porch. Is this where she lives? He asked no one in particular. His voice carried across the sudden silence. Sophie's mother stepped in front of her. Can we help you? The man held up his hands, showing they were empty. My name is James Mitchell. Robert Mitchell is my father. He took a step toward the porch. I've spent the last hour listening to my sister Karen tell me about what your daughter did for our family today. The tension didn't leave Sophie's mother's shoulders. Your father is home safe? Yes, James nodded. Thanks to your daughter. Do you know how long he had been wandering? How far he had walked? He took another step closer. The doctors told us his Alzheimer's was getting worse, but we never thought. Alzheimer's? Sophie whispered to her mother. What's that? A sickness that makes you forget things, baby. Her mother answered softly, still watching James. Important things, like where you live or who you love. Sophie thought about that. Like how Mrs. Thompson sometimes forgets where she puts her glasses. Much worse than that, dear. Mrs. Thompson said gently. James had reached the bottom of the porch steps now. The police car idled at the curb, its presence a silent reminder of the afternoon's events. When my father went missing, James continued, we called the police. They searched for hours. And all that time, he was just walking, getting more lost, more confused. His voice cracked slightly. Until your daughter found him. I just helped him, Sophie said from behind her mother. Like you taught me to, Mama. To be kind to older people. James smiled, but his eyes were wet. Do you know what happened after most people saw my father today? They crossed the street. They hurried past. They called the police. But not you. The neighbors who remained had gone quiet, their phones lowered now. Even Mrs. Parker had stopped whispering. Your daughter didn't see a confused old white man who might be dangerous, James said to Sophie's mother. She saw someone who needed help. She held his hand. She talked to him about butterflies while everyone else just stared and waited for something bad to happen. Sophie felt her mother's hand trembling slightly where it rested on her shoulder. I taught her to be kind, she said softly, even when others aren't kind to her. James nodded, looking at the gathered neighbors, the police car, the phones that had recorded everything. I saw some of those recordings, he said. I saw how people reacted when they saw your daughter with my father. I heard what they were saying. The silence grew heavier. Some of the neighbors looked away. But I also saw how she stayed with him, James continued. How she wasn't afraid, even when everyone else was telling her to be afraid. He reached into his suit jacket, pulling out an envelope. That's why I'm here. Sophie's mother stiffened again. We don't need dash, please, James interrupted. Let me finish. My father, he worked his whole life to give his children opportunities. He believed education was the key to everything. He held up the envelope. Inside, this is a promise. A full scholarship for Sophie's education, from elementary school through college, if she wants it. The police car's engine shut off. The officer stepped out, watching. More neighbors appeared on their porches, drawn by the scene unfolding in the growing dusk. Why? Sophie's mother asked, her voice barely a whisper. James looked directly at Sophie. Because today, your daughter taught this whole neighborhood something important. Something my father spent his life believing. That kindness doesn't see color. That helping others isn't about being brave or strong. It's about being human. Sophie didn't understand everything being said, but she understood the way her mother's breath hitched, the way Mrs. Thompson dabbed at her eyes with her apron, the way the neighbors had gone completely silent. You don't have to decide now, James said, placing the envelope on the porch step. Talk it over as a family. But know this, what your daughter did today. It wasn't just about helping my father find his way home. It was about showing all of us a better way forward. As James turned to leave, Sophie stepped around her mother. Mr. James, she called out. Will Mr. Robert be okay? He turned back, his smile sad but genuine. He'll have good days and bad days, Sophie. But he won't forget what you did for him. None of us will. The black SUV pulled away, followed shortly by the police car. The neighbors began to disperse, their phones finally put away. But something had shifted in the air, in the way they looked at Sophie and her mother, in the way Mrs. Thompson stood straighter on her porch. Sophie looked up at her mother, who was staring at the envelope on the step. Did I do something wrong, Mama? Her mother knelt down, pulling her into another tight hug. No, baby, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. You did everything exactly right. As the street lights flickered on, casting long shadows across Mrs. Thompson's porch, Sophie thought about Mr. Robert, about blue butterflies and lost glasses, about kindness and courage in finding your way home. She didn't understand everything that had happened today, but she understood this. Sometimes the scariest moments could lead to the most beautiful surprises, if you were brave enough to face them with an open heart. The next morning dawned different. Sophie noticed it the moment she stepped out of their apartment for school. Mrs. Parker, usually quick to hurry inside when she saw them, stood at her mailbox and waved. Good morning, Sophie. Miss Williams. She smiled, actually smiled, at them both. Sophie's mother gripped her hand tighter, nodding cautiously. Good morning, Mrs. Parker. They walked down the sidewalk where just yesterday Mr. Robert had stood lost and confused. Sophie glanced at every house they passed, remembering how curtains had twitched, how phones had recorded, how whispers had filled the air. Mama, Sophie asked, swinging their joined hands. Will we see Mr. Robert again? Her mother adjusted Sophie's backpack strap with her free hand. I don't know, baby. His family might dash. There she is. A voice called out. Mrs. Thompson stood on her porch, but she wasn't alone. Mr. Robert sat in her porch swing, his daughter Karen beside him. Sophie stopped walking. Mr. Robert? Her mother hesitated. We'll be late for school. Please, Karen called out. Just for a moment? Dad's been asking for her since he woke up. They crossed the street slowly. Sophie noticed more neighbors emerging from their houses, but their faces were different today. No phones appeared. No suspicious glances. Just quiet observation and something else. Something new. Mr. Robert looked better than yesterday. His bay sweater was neat, his silver hair combed. When he saw Sophie, his face lit up with recognition. The butterfly girl, he said clearly, smiling. Karen, it's the butterfly girl. Sophie's mother's grip loosened slightly. Karen stood up, approaching them. He remembered her all night. Kept talking about blue butterflies and kind eyes. How is he? Sophie's mother asked softly. Karen's smile faltered slightly. Good days and bad days, like James said. Today's a good day. He wanted to come thank Sophie properly. Mr. Robert patted the swing beside him. Tell me about the butterflies again. Sophie looked up at her mother, who nodded slowly. She climbed onto the swing while the adults watched, their faces a mix of emotions she couldn't quite read. Well, Sophie began, the butterflies in my drawing are blue and orange, like the ones in Mrs. Thompson's garden. As she talked, more neighbors gathered. But unlike yesterday, they didn't whisper or stare. They listened. Mrs. Rodriguez brought over fresh-baked cookies. Mr. Jenkins, who'd stood guard on his porch yesterday, came with his wife and their dog. You know, Mrs. Thompson said, serving lemonade, I've lived here 40 years. Never seen the neighborhood come together like this. Sophie's mother checked her watch. We really should get to school? Oh. Karen straightened. Actually, that's another reason we came. Dad's not the only one who wanted to say thank you. She pulled out her phone, showing them a screen full of messages. The whole neighborhood's been texting. They want to do something special. Mr. Robert nodded along, though his eyes had gotten that slightly confused look again. Sophie instinctively reached for his hand, and he smiled at her touch. Special? Sophie's mother asked warily. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward. We've all been talking, Miss Williams, about yesterday. About how we acted. About what we could have done differently. I called the police, Mrs. Parker admitted quietly from the gathered crowd. I saw a little black girl with a strange white man and I just assumed. She looked down. I'm so ashamed. Sophie didn't fully understand what Mrs. Parker meant, but she felt her mother tense beside her. We want to do better, Mr. Jenkins said. Be better neighbors. Better people. Karen squeezed her father's shoulder. Dad's condition, it could happen to anyone. Getting lost, confused. We all might need help someday. And your daughter, Mrs. Rodriguez added, she showed us what real courage looks like. Not being afraid to help, even when everyone else was afraid to act. Sophie's mother blinked rapidly, her voice thick. She's just a child who reminded us what humanity looks like, Karen said. She turned to the gathered neighbors. Show them. One by one, the neighbors stepped forward. Mrs. Rodriguez handed over a basket full of fresh bread and homemade meals. Mr. Jenkins presented a handmade card signed by everyone on the street. Mrs. Parker held out a brand-new backpack, the princess one Sophie had admired in the store window. We can't accept Dash, Sophie's mother started. Please, Mrs. Thompson interrupted. Let us do this. Not because we feel guilty, though many of us do, but because your daughter showed us something important. Something we'd forgotten. Mr. Robert squeezed Sophie's hand. Butterflies, he said softly. Blue ones. Sophie looked up at her mother, saw the tears in her eyes. Mama, are you sad? No, baby. She wiped her eyes quickly. Just surprised. Karen checked her watch. We should let you get to school. But there's more. The whole neighborhood wants to help with Sophie's education. Add to what James offered. Not because we have to, but because we want to. Because she reminded us what community really means. Sophie's mother shook her head. You don't need to dash. We want to, Mrs. Parker said firmly. Please, let us be the neighbors we should have been all along. Mr. Robert stood shakily, Karen supporting him. Thank you, he said to Sophie, the words clear despite his confusion. "For helping me find home." Sophie hugged him gently. "You're welcome, Mr. Robert. Will you visit again?" "Every chance we get," Karen promised. "Dad does better on his good days when he has something to look forward to." As they said their goodbyes, the neighbors dispersing with waves and smiles, Sophie noticed something else had changed. The street felt different, warmer somehow, like the berries that had existed yesterday had started to crack and crumble. They walked to school surrounded by other families, all heading the same way. Children who had never played with Sophie now asked to walk beside her. Parents who had pulled their kids away yesterday now encouraged them to join her. "Mama," Sophie asked as they neared the school, "why is everyone being so nice today?" Her mother stopped walking, kneeling down to eye level. "Because sometimes, baby, it takes a child's heart to teach adults what they've forgotten. You didn't see color or danger yesterday. You just saw someone who needed help. Like you taught me," Sophie said proudly. "Yes." Her mother hugged her tight. "Like I taught you. And now you've taught all of us." The school bell rang in the distance. As they hurried toward the building, Sophie glanced back. The neighborhood stretched out behind them, but it wasn't the same place it had been yesterday. Something had shifted, like sunshine breaking through clouds after a storm. Mr. Robert had found his way home yesterday. But maybe, Sophie thought, he had helped an entire neighborhood find its way home too, to the kind of community it should have been all along. The classroom felt different too. Sophie sat at her usual desk near the window, but instead of the usual empty chairs around her, Sarah and Emma had moved their seats closer. "Is it true?" Sarah whispered during math. "Did you really help a lost grandpa yesterday?" Sophie nodded, keeping her eyes on her multiplication worksheet. "He just wanted to go home. My mom showed me the video," Emma added. "She said you were really brave." Ms. Martinez cleared her throat from the front of the room. "Girls, less talking, more multiplying." But even Ms. Martinez seemed different today. During morning announcements, she'd smiled directly at Sophie, something that hadn't happened since the substitute teacher incident. At recess, instead of playing alone by the fence, Sophie found herself surrounded by classmates. They all wanted to hear the story firsthand. "Weren't you scared?" Katie asked, her eyes wide. Sophie thought about it. "Not really. He reminded me of Mrs. Thompson when she gets confused." "Who's Mrs. Thompson?" several voices asked at once. "She watches me after school. She's really nice. She makes the best cookies and has blue butterflies in her garden." The conversation shifted to cookies and butterflies, but Sophie noticed something else had changed. No one moved away when she got too close. No one accidentally forgot to pass her the ball during games. When the final bell rang, Sophie walked out to find not just her mother waiting, but a small crowd. Mr. Robert sat in a lawn chair under the school's oak tree, Karen and James standing beside him. Mrs. Thompson was there too, along with several neighbors. "Surprise!" they called out as Sophie approached. Her mother stood slightly apart, watching with an expression Sophie couldn't quite read, like she was happy and worried all at the same time. "What's happening?" Sophie asked, reaching for her mother's hand. James stepped forward. "Well, we had an idea. Since you helped our father find his way home, we thought maybe we could help make your school feel more like home too." Karen held up a large canvas. "We heard about your butterfly drawing. Dad hasn't stopped talking about it. So we thought." She turned the canvas around. It was a painting of butterflies, dozens of them, in every color imaginable, but with extra blue ones prominent in the center. "The school has agreed to hang it in the main hallway," James explained, "with a plaque that tells your story." Sophie's classmates had gathered around, staring at the painting with wonder. Even the substitute teacher who had ignored Sophie stood at the school entrance, her face flushed with what looked like shame. Mr. Robert pointed at the blue butterflies. "Like in the garden," he said clearly, having one of his good moments. Like the little girl said. "That's right, Dad," Karen smiled, squeezing his shoulder. Ms. Martinez stepped forward from the school entrance. "Would like to do something else too." She looked directly at Sophie's mother. "Miss Williams, we've been talking about how we can make our school more inclusive, more welcoming. Would you consider joining our diversity committee? We need voices like yours." Sophie felt her mother's hand tremble slightly in hers. I'll think about it." More parents and teachers had joined the crowd now. Sophie recognized Sarah's mother, the one she'd watched hug her daughter yesterday. But today, instead of hurrying past, she approached them. Miss Williams, she said softly, I owe you and Sophie an apology. When my daughter wanted to invite Sophie to her birthday party last month, I made excuses. I was wrong. So wrong. Sophie's mother stiffened. You don't need to dash. Yes, I do, Sarah's mother interrupted. We all do. We've let our prejudices affect our children. But your daughter, she glanced at Sophie. She showed us what we should have been teaching all along. Sarah pushed forward through the crowd. Can Sophie come to my party next week? Please. Mom, please. Miss Williams. Before either mother could respond, Mr. Roberts spoke up again. Butterflies don't care what flower they land on, he said, with surprising clarity. They just know what's beautiful. Everyone went quiet, absorbing his words. Even in his confusion, even with his illness, he captured something profound. James cleared his throat. That's not all we came to share. He pulled out another envelope. The community has come together. Not just our neighborhood, but the whole town. After the video spread. Video? Sophie's mother asked sharply. Of Sophie helping Dad, Karen explained quickly. It went viral. In a good way. People were moved by her kindness, especially given. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Given all the tensions we see every day. The point is, James continued, people want to help. Local businesses, community organizations, even strangers. They've all contributed to Sophie's education fund. It's not charity, he added, seeing Sophie's mother's expression. It's an investment in the kind of future your daughter showed us is possible. Sophie didn't understand everything being said, but she understood the tears in her mother's eyes, the way Mrs. Thompson beamed with pride, the way her classmates looked at her with newfound respect. There's more, Ms. Martinez said. We're starting a new program at school, the Butterfly Effect Initiative, teaching children about empathy, about helping others, about seeing past differences. And we'd like Sophie to help lead it. Me? Sophie asked, surprised. Yes, you, her teacher smiled. Because you showed us all how it's done. Mr. Roberts stood up shakily from his chair. Can I see the garden again? The one with the blue butterflies. Of course, Dad, Karen said gently. Mrs. Thompson has invited us all over for cookies and lemonade. The crowd began to move, parents and children and teachers all walking together toward Mrs. Thompson's house. But this time, no one walked ahead or behind. They moved as one community, the berries that had divided them just days ago crumbling with each step. Sophie walked between her mother and Mr. Robert, holding both their hands. She noticed Sarah and Emma walking nearby, their mothers chatting with other parents who'd never spoken to each other before. Mama, she whispered, is this what you meant about teaching adults what they forgot? Her mother squeezed her hand, tears still shining in her eyes. Yes, baby. This is exactly what I meant. As they walked, butterflies, real ones, danced in Mrs. Thompson's garden ahead of them. Blue ones, orange ones, yellow ones. None of them caring what flower they landed on, just like Mr. Robert had said. Just knowing what was beautiful, what was right, what was true. The afternoon sun painted everything in warm golden light. And for the first time since Sophie could remember, their walk home from school felt like walking into a new world. One where kindness broke down walls, where courage wore the face of a child, and where finding your way home meant helping others find theirs too. Mrs. Thompson's house buzzed with more people than Sophie had ever seen in it. Kids ran through the garden, parents clustered on the porch, and teachers mingled in the living room. The smell of fresh-baked cookies filled the air. Careful with those flowers, Mrs. Thompson called out as some children darted past her prize roses. But she wasn't angry. She smiled, watching the yard she'd tended alone for so many years now full of life. Sophie sat on the porch swing with Mr. Robert, who was having one of his clearer moments. Karen hovered nearby, but she'd relaxed her watchful stance as the afternoon wore on. Tell me again, Mr. Robert said, patting Sophie's hand. About the day you found me. It was the third time he'd asked, but Sophie didn't mind. You were looking for home, she said simply. Like the butterflies look for flowers. From inside, they heard James's voice rise above the chatter. He was talking to Sophie's mother and a group of community leaders about the education fund. It's not just about Sophie anymore, he was saying. We want to establish a permanent scholarship for other children who show the same kind of courage and compassion. Sophie's mother's voice carried a note of protest. That's too much. No. Another voice joined in. Sophie recognized it as the mayor's. It's not enough. Your daughter started something here. Something important. Mr. Robert squeezed Sophie's hand. I remember being lost, he said suddenly, his voice clearer than it had been all day. Everything was scary. Strange faces, strange places. But then, butterflies. Karen stepped closer, surprised by her father's lucidity. Dad! She wasn't strange, he continued, looking at Sophie. She wasn't scary. She was just kind. His eyes grew distant again. Like Mary used to be. Mary loved butterflies too. Mom did love butterflies, Karen said softly, wiping her eyes. Inside, the conversation continued. Sophie could hear Ms. Martinez talking about the new school initiative. We're already seeing changes, the teacher was saying. Children who never played together are becoming friends. Parents who never spoke are organizing playdates. The butterfly effect, someone else added. One small act of kindness creating waves of change. Sarah appeared at the porch steps, holding a pink envelope. Sophie, she called out tentatively. This is for you. It's for my birthday party next week. Mom said I can invite whoever I want. Sophie looked at the envelope, remembering all the parties she'd watched happen from Mrs. Thompson's porch. Really? Really? Sarah smiled. And maybe you could tell everyone the butterfly story? The real one, not the video one. Before Sophie could answer, a commotion rose from the street. A news van had pulled up, cameras and microphones visible through the windows. Sophie's mother was out the door in an instant. No, she said firmly. No interviews. No cameras. But the public wants to know. A reporter started. The public doesn't need to know anything, James interrupted, stepping forward. This isn't about publicity. It's about community. Mr. Roberts stirred on the swing. Too many people, he mumbled, his earlier clarity fading. Need to go home. It's okay, Sophie said quickly, holding his hand tighter. We're already home. See? There are the butterflies. Sure enough, a cluster of butterflies danced around Mrs. Thompson's flowers. Mr. Robert relaxed, watching them. The news van eventually left, but something about its presence had changed the mood. Parents gathered their children, talking in low voices about privacy and protection. Maybe we should go too. Dad, Karen said gently. No, Mrs. Thompson spoke up from her doorway. Stay. All of you, stay. This is what we need, not cameras and reporters, but this. People coming together, breaking bread, being neighbors. She disappeared inside and returned with more cookies and lemonade. The tension eased as children ran back to play. Parents resumed their conversations, and the afternoon sun painted everything in warm, gentle light. Sophie's mother sat down beside her on the swing, Mr. Robert having moved to a cushioned chair with Karen. How are you feeling, baby? About all of this? Sophie thought for a moment. Happy, she said finally, but also confused. About what? Why didn't we do this before? Be neighbors? Be friends? Her mother was quiet for a long time. Around them, the party continued, children laughing, adults talking, barriers breaking down with each shared smile and conversation. Sometimes, her mother finally said, people forget how easy it is to be kind. They let fear and prejudice build walls. But you, baby, you walked right through those walls like they weren't even there. Because they weren't, Sophie said simply. Not for butterflies. Her mother laughed softly, but there were tears in her eyes. As the afternoon wore on, more changes revealed themselves. Mrs. Parker offered to watch Sophie sometimes when Mrs. Thompson needed a break. Mr. Jenkins talked about starting a community garden. Parents exchanged phone numbers and planned weekend activities. See what you started, Mrs. Thompson said, sitting beside Sophie. All because you were brave enough to help a lost soul find his way home. Sophie watched Mr. Robert dozing in his chair, Karen gently adjusting his sweater. She watched Sarah and Emma playing with kids they'd never spoken to before. She watched her mother deep in conversation with parents who'd once crossed the street to avoid them. I didn't do anything special, she said. I just did what Mama taught me. Mrs. Thompson patted her knee. Sometimes the most special things are the simplest ones, dear. Like kindness, like courage, like seeing people for who they are, not what we fear they might be. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Mrs. Thompson's garden, the party slowly wound down. Parents gathered their children, but not before making plans to meet again. Teachers left with new ideas for their classrooms. Community leaders departed with promises of support and change. Mr. Robert woke up as Karen prepared to take him home. "The butterfly girl," he said, smiling at Sophie. "You'll visit every day," Sophie promised. "And we'll watch the butterflies together." James helped his father stand. "Tomorrow," he said to Sophie's mother, "we'll start the paperwork for the scholarship fund. No cameras, no publicity. Just community helping community." As people said their goodbyes, Sophie noticed something else had changed. The street that had once felt so divided now felt connected. The neighbors who had once been strangers now felt like family. "Mama," she asked as they walked the short distance to their apartment, "are we still different from everyone else?" Her mother stopped walking, kneeling down to look Sophie in the eyes. "We're all different, baby, but that's not what matters. What matters is that we're all human. We all need help sometimes. We all need kindness. And sometimes, it takes a child to remind us of that." They looked back at Mrs. Thompson's house, where the last guests were leaving, where butterflies still danced in the evening light, where walls had crumbled and bridges had been built. "Tomorrow will be different," her mother said softly. "Better?" Sophie asked. "Yes, baby. Better. Because you showed everyone how to make it better." As they climbed the stairs to their apartment, Sophie thought about butterflies and kindness, about lost souls and found communities, about how sometimes the smallest wings could create the biggest changes. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow would be better. All because she'd seen past the walls others had built, straight to the heart of what mattered. That everyone, sometimes, just needs help finding their way home. The knock came early the next morning. Sophie was still eating breakfast, her new princess backpack propped by the door, when they heard it. Her mother paused in packing Sophie's lunch. Who could that be? Through the peephole, they saw James Mitchell standing in the hallway, holding a thick folder. He wasn't alone. Karen stood beside him, and behind them, Mayor Thompson, no relation to Mrs. Thompson, shifted nervously in his suit. Sophie's mother opened the door slowly. "Mr. Mitchell, is everything okay? Is Mr. Robert?" "Dad's fine," Karen smiled. "Is having breakfast with Mrs. Thompson. Actually, that's part of why we're here." James held up the folder. "We need to talk about some things. Important things." Sophie watched her mother's face do that thing it did when she was worried but trying not to show it. "I have to get Sophie to school, and I have classes to teach. That's why I'm here." The mayor stepped forward. "The school board has approved a substitute for your classes today. This is too important to rush." Sophie's mother gripped the door frame. "I don't understand. May we come in?" James asked gently. Their small apartment suddenly felt smaller with 3 adults crowding the living room. Sophie stayed at the kitchen table, spooning her cereal slowly, watching. "First," James began, opening the folder, "the education fund. It's grown beyond anything we imagined." "The video dash, I wish people would stop sharing that," Sophie's mother interrupted. "I know," Karen said softly. "But it's inspired people. Not just here, but across the country. They want to help." The mayor cleared his throat. "Which brings us to the second item. The city council met early this morning. We want to establish a permanent program. The Butterfly Effect initiative you've heard about? We want to make it official. Citywide." Sophie's mother sat down heavily on their worn couch. "What does that mean, exactly?" James spread papers across their coffee table. "Education programs, community outreach. Breaking down barriers between neighborhoods, between people. All inspired by what your daughter did. And we want you to lead it," the mayor added. "Me?" Sophie's mother's voice cracked. "But I'm just a teacher." "Exactly," Karen smiled. "You're a teacher who raised a daughter to see past color, past fear, past prejudice. We need that. Our whole community needs that." Sophie abandoned her cereal, moving closer to her mother. The adults kept talking about things she didn't fully understand. Budgets, programs, initiatives. But she understood the tears in her mother's eyes, the trembling in her hands. "It's a full-time position," the mayor was saying. "Better pay than teaching, plus benefits." And he glanced at James. James pulled out another document. "We want to help with housing too. There's a house for sale on our street, right next to Mrs. Thompson's. The community has pooled resources." "No," Sophie's mother stood up. "That's too much. We can't accept Dash." "Yes, you can," Karen said firmly. "Because it's not charity. It's investment. In our community, in our future, in the kind of world Sophie showed us is possible. Sophie tugged her mother's sleeve. Mama, could we live next to Mrs. Thompson? And the butterflies? Her mother knelt down, wiping tears from her eyes. Baby, it's complicated. Actually, James smiled, it's not. The house is paid for. The job is real. The only complicated thing is accepting that sometimes good things happen because a child was brave enough to be kind. The mayor stepped forward. Miss Williams, our city needs this. We've been divided too long, living in fear of each other too long. Your daughter showed us another way. Sophie watched her mother's face, saw the struggle there. But my students will benefit from this program more than from having you as just their teacher, Karen said. Think about it. Real change, across the whole city. All because Sophie helped my father find his way home. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Thompson stood there with Mr. Robert, who was having another good morning. Sorry to intrude, Mrs. Thompson said, not looking sorry at all. But Robert insisted on seeing the butterfly girl before his doctor's appointment. Mr. Robert smiled at Sophie. I remembered, he said clearly. I remembered you helped me. Sophie ran to hug him. He smelled like Mrs. Thompson's cookies and morning sunshine. See, James gestured at the scene. This is what we want to create. Not just in one neighborhood, but everywhere. Connections, understanding, community. Sophie's mother watched her daughter with Mr. Robert, saw how natural it was, how simple. No fear, no prejudice, no walls. The house, she said finally, her voice shaky. It has enough room for a garden. A big one, Karen grinned. Perfect for butterflies. The mayor pulled out more papers. We can have you moved in by next week. The program can start immediately. Miss Williams, say yes. Let your daughter's butterfly effect keep spreading. Sophie looked up from her conversation with Mr. Robert about the garden they could plant. Please, Mama, can we live near the butterflies? Her mother took a deep breath. What about the reporters? The attention. Already handled, James assured her. The city's issued a statement asking for privacy. This isn't about publicity. It's about real change. Mrs. Thompson stepped fully into the apartment. Say yes, dear. Let us be real neighbors. Let us build something beautiful from what Sophie started. Sophie's mother looked around the small apartment, at the worn furniture, the cramped kitchen, the life they'd built with what little they had. Then she looked at the people crowded into their living room, at the papers promising change, at her daughter's hopeful face. Okay, she whispered. Then stronger, okay. Yes. The room erupted in smiles and tears. Mr. Robert clapped his hands. Butterflies, he said happily. Blue ones. The mayor started organizing papers for signatures. James and Karen hugged Sophie's mother. Mrs. Thompson wiped tears from her eyes. School, Sophie's mother said suddenly. Sophie needs to dash. Already taken care of, the mayor smiled. The whole school's having an assembly today. About kindness, courage, and community. About the butterfly effect of one small act of compassion. Sophie tugged her mother's hand. Can Mr. Robert come to the assembly? And Mrs. Thompson? We'll all be there, Karen promised. The whole community will. As the adults handled paperwork, Sophie sat with Mr. Robert by the window. Will you help me plant butterflies in our new garden? She asked. He smiled, one of his clear moments shining through. Butterflies come to kind hearts, he said. Like yours. You helped me find home. Now you're helping everyone find home. Sophie didn't fully understand everything changing around her. But she understood this. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could grow wings, could fly far beyond what anyone imagined, could help whole communities find their way home to what they should have been all along. Her mother signed the last paper, tears streaming freely now. Ready for school, baby? Ready for everything to change? Sophie took Mr. Robert's hand in one of hers, her mother's in the other. Ready, she said. The butterflies are waiting. They walked out together, not just to school, but towards something bigger, something beautiful, something that started with one lost soul and one brave heart, and grew into wings of change spreading across an entire community, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could create the biggest transformations of all. The school assembly hall buzzed with excitement. Students filled the rows of seats while parents and community members lined the walls. Sophie sat in the front row between Sarah and Emma, her mother standing near the podium with James and the principal. "I've never seen so many people here," Sarah whispered, looking around. "Not even at the Christmas concert." Sophie nodded, watching Mr. Roberts settle into a specially reserved seat with Karen. He was having a good morning, smiling and waving at everyone who passed. The principal stepped up to the microphone. "Today," she began, "we're here to talk about something important. About how one small act of kindness can change an entire community." Sophie felt everyone's eyes turn toward her. She stared down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "But first," the principal continued, "we need to acknowledge some hard truths. About how we've failed some of our students. About how we've let fear and prejudice affect our actions." The substitute teacher who had ignored Sophie shifted uncomfortably against the wall. "Last week," the principal went on, "one of our youngest students showed more courage and compassion than most adults. She saw past differences that many of us let divide us. She helped someone in need when others only saw reasons to be afraid." Mr. Roberts stood up suddenly. "The butterfly girl," he said clearly, pointing at Sophie. "She helped me find home." A murmur ran through the crowd. Karen gently guided her father back to his seat. But his words had shifted something in the room. People weren't just listening now, they were feeling. James stepped up to the podium. "My father has Alzheimer's," he said directly. That day, he wandered far from home, confused and scared. Adults saw him and looked away. They crossed the street. They called the police. But one little girl saw him differently. Sophie's mother took the microphone next. Her hands trembled, but her voice was strong. "My daughter did what I taught her, to be kind, to help others. But I never taught her to see differences, because differences don't matter when someone needs help." The assembly hall was completely silent now. Even the youngest children seemed to understand the weight of the moment. "That's why today," the principal announced, "we're launching our new program. The Butterfly Effect Initiative will teach our children what Sophie already knows, that kindness doesn't see color, that courage doesn't know age, that community means helping each other find our way home." Teachers began distributing blue butterfly pins to every student. Sarah pinned hers to her shirt immediately. "These butterflies," the principal explained, "represent our commitment to change, to being better, to seeing past our differences." Sophie watched as her classmates proudly attached their pins. Even the kids who had once avoided her were smiling now, showing her their butterflies. The substitute teacher stepped forward suddenly. "Bye. I need to say something." The principal nodded, and the teacher walked to the podium. She looked directly at Sophie. "I failed you," she said, her voice cracking. "I let my own prejudices affect how I treated you. And watching you show such kindness to Mr. Mitchell, it shamed me. It showed me how wrong I was." Sophie didn't know what to say. Her mother moved closer, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "That's why this program is so important," James took over. "Because we all have prejudices to overcome. We all have walls to break down. And sometimes, it takes a child to show us how." Mr. Roberts stood up again. "Tell them about the butterflies," he called out. "In the garden. Blue ones." This time, Karen let him speak. Because somehow, even through his confusion, he understood something essential about what was happening. "We're going to create butterfly gardens at every school in the district," the mayor announced, stepping forward. "Places of beauty and peace, where children can learn the lessons Sophie taught us." The assembly continued with more announcements about the scholarship fund, about community programs, about changes coming to the school and the city. But Sophie was watching her classmates, seeing how they looked at their butterfly pins, how they smiled at each other across old divides. During the reception afterward, parents who had never spoken to Sophie's mother now surrounded her, offering support and friendship. Children who had once avoided Sophie now wanted to sit with her, to hear her tell the story themselves. "Can we come see your new garden when it's ready?" Sarah asked. "Mom said we can help plant flowers." "Everyone can help," Sophie said, looking around at her classmates. "That's what community means." Mr. Robert made his way over, Karen close behind. "Blue butterflies," he said, touching Sophie's pin. "Like the day you helped me." "Yes, Mr. Robert," Sophie smiled. "Just like that day." The substitute teacher approached hesitantly. "Sophie, would you help me learn? About being better? About seeing past differences?" Sophie looked up at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. "That's easy," Sophie said. Just look with your heart instead of your eyes. Like the butterflies do. The teacher knelt down, tears in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Sophie, for how I treated you. It's okay, Sophie said, surprised to find she meant it. We're all learning together now. The assembly hall slowly emptied, but something remained. A feeling, a promise, a change. Parents exchanged phone numbers, planning playdates and community events. Teachers gathered in groups, discussing how to incorporate the butterfly effect lessons into their classes. Outside, Mrs. Thompson waited with a surprise. She'd brought butterfly bushes for every classroom. So every child can watch them grow, she explained. Just like we're all growing into something better. As they helped distribute the plants, Sophie noticed other changes. The older kids were helping the younger ones. Children of different backgrounds played together on the playground. Parents who had once hurried past each other now stopped to chat. See what you started? Her mother asked softly, watching it all. All because you were brave enough to be kind. Sophie looked around at her transformed school, at the butterfly pins glinting in the sunlight, at the new friendships forming, at the walls coming down between people who had once seen only differences. I just helped someone find home, she said simply. Yes, her mother hugged her close. And in doing that, you helped an entire community find its way home too. Mr. Robert watched the butterflies beginning to gather around Mrs. Thompson's bushes. Beauty knows no color, he said in one of his clear moments. Kindness knows no boundaries. The butterfly girl showed us that. As the day wound down, Sophie stood in what would become the school's butterfly garden. Students and parents worked together, planting flowers and bushes, creating paths and benches. The garden would grow, just like the changes in their community would grow, spreading their wings far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Ready to go home? Her mother asked, gathering their things. Sophie looked around one last time, at her classmates wearing their butterfly pins, at Mr. Robert telling anyone who would listen about the day she helped him, at the community coming together in ways that once seemed impossible. Yes, she said, taking her mother's hand. But we're already home, aren't we? All of us together. Her mother squeezed her hand, understanding that home wasn't just a place, it was a feeling, a community, a way of seeing past differences to the hearts that beat the same in all of us. And sometimes, it took a child's courage to help everyone find their way there. 1 month later, Sophie stood in her new garden, watching butterflies dance around the flowers she and Mr. Robert had planted together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and the air smelled of fresh grass and possibility. Ready for your big day? Her mother called from their new front porch. Today was special, the official launch of the Butterfly Effect initiative across the city. But more than that, it was exactly 1 month since Sophie had helped a lost man find his way home, and in doing so, helped an entire community find its heart. Almost, Sophie replied, watching a blue butterfly land on the flowers Mr. Robert had specifically chosen. He'd been having more good days lately, especially when he worked in the garden. Their new house beside Mrs. Thompson's felt like it had always been their home. Neighbors dropped by regularly, not just to visit but to help with the garden that had become a symbol of their changing community. The news crews will be here soon, her mother said, stepping into the garden. Remember, you don't have to talk to them if you don't want to. I know, Sophie nodded. But Mr. Robert says sometimes stories need to be told so other people can learn from them. Her mother smiled, adjusting Sophie's blue butterfly pin, now worn by hundreds across the city. When did you get so wise? She was always wise, Mrs. Thompson called from her yard. We just needed her to show us how to see it. The street began to fill with people. Sarah and Emma arrived with their parents, all wearing butterfly pins. Mr. Jenkins brought his famous lemonade. Mrs. Parker carried a tray of cookies she'd baked using Mrs. Thompson's recipe. Mr. Robert arrived with Karen and James, wearing a new sweater with a butterfly embroidered on the pocket. The garden, he said immediately, moving toward his favorite spot. Need to check the butterflies. Sophie joined him by the flowers. Over the past month, their garden had become his anchor, a place where his memories seemed stronger, where confusion gave way to clarity more often. Tell me again, he said, touching a blue flower. About the day. Before Sophie could begin, a fleet of vehicles turned onto their street, news vans, city officials, people from all over coming to witness the launch of something that started with one small act of kindness. The mayor stepped up to the podium they'd set up in front of Sophie's garden. Cameras rolled as he spoke about change, about community, about breaking down walls that had divided them for too long. 1 month ago, he said, a 7-year-old girl showed us what we'd forgotten. That kindness knows no color, that courage knows no age, that community means helping each other find our way home. Sophie stood between her mother and Mr. Robert, watching as the mayor unveiled the city's new initiative. Every school would have a butterfly garden. Every student would learn about breaking down barriers. Every community would have programs to bring people together. But more than programs and gardens, the mayor continued, we're creating connection. Real change. And it all started right here, with one child who saw past differences to help someone in need. The substitute teacher who had once ignored Sophie now ran the school's inclusion program. She stepped forward to announce new teaching guidelines, new ways of ensuring every child felt seen and valued. Sarah's mother spoke about the parent committee she'd formed, dedicated to breaking down social barriers that had divided families for generations. Mr. Jenkins described the community gardens springing up across the city, places where neighbors could grow food and friendship together. Through it all, Sophie held Mr. Robert's hand, feeling how steady it had become over the past month. His confusion still came and went, but here in the garden, surrounded by butterflies and community, he found pieces of himself that his illness had scattered. I remember, he said suddenly, his voice clear and strong. I remember being lost. Everything was strange, scary. But then an angel with kind eyes found me. Helped me find my way home. His words carried across the crowd, silencing the speeches. Karen wiped tears from her eyes. Not an angel, Sophie corrected gently. Just someone who remembered what matters. And what matters? James asked, stepping closer. Sophie looked around at her transformed community, at former strangers now sharing food and friendship, at children playing together without seeing differences, at gardens growing where fences once stood. That we're all just people, she said. All just trying to find our way home. The mayor invited Sophie to help cut the ribbon, officially launching the initiative. But she shook her head, pulling Mr. Robert forward instead. We should do it together, she said. Because that's what community means. They cut the ribbon together. A small black girl and an elderly white man who had once been strangers, now bound by butterflies and kindness and the simple truth that differences disappear when hearts connect. The celebration continued throughout the day. Children played in the garden while adults shared stories and food. News crews captured it all. But they couldn't quite capture the feeling, the sense that something fundamental had shifted, that walls had crumbled, that a community had remembered how to be whole. As evening approached, Sophie sat with Mr. Robert on her porch swing, watching butterflies dance in the golden light. Tell me again, he said, but this time his eyes were clear, his smile knowing. About how one small act of kindness can change everything. Sophie looked at their garden, at the neighbors who had become family, at the community that had learned to see with their hearts instead of their eyes. I didn't change everything, she said softly. I just helped someone find their way home. And then everyone remembered they were lost too, Mr. Robert finished. Lost behind walls we built ourselves. Until a child showed us how to knock them down. Her mother joined them on the porch, along with Mrs. Thompson, Karen, and James. One by one, neighbors gathered as the sun set, drawn to the place where change had begun. What happens now? Sarah asked from the steps, where she sat with other children who had once been strangers but were now friends. Sophie watched the last butterfly of the day dance past, its wings catching the fading light. Now we keep growing, she said. Like the garden, like the butterflies, like love. Her mother wrapped an arm around her shoulders. And we remember what you taught us, that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can have the biggest wings. Mr. Robert nodded, having one of his clearest moments yet. And that home isn't a place, he said, looking around at their gathered community. It's where hearts connect, where differences fade, where kindness blooms like butterflies in a garden of hope. As darkness fell, fireflies joined the last butterflies in the garden. Children laughed and played while adults talked softly on porches and lawns that no longer had fences between them. Sophie looked up at the stars beginning to appear, thinking about how one afternoon, one choice, one moment of seeing with her heart instead of her eyes had created wings of change that would keep spreading, keep growing, Keep helping people find their way home to the truth that had been there all along. That love knows no color, that kindness knows no bounds, and that sometimes it takes a child to remind us all how simple it really is to make the world a better place. One small act of compassion at a time. Ready for bed, butterfly girl? Her mother asked softly. Sophie took one last look at her garden, at Mr. Robert dozing peacefully in the porch swing, at the community gathered in the gentle evening light. Yes, she said, standing up. But Mama. Yes, baby. We're all home now, aren't we? All of us together. Her mother hugged her close, tears shining in her eyes. Yes, baby. Thanks to you, we're all finally home. And in the garden, butterflies danced in the last light of day, their wings carrying the promise of more change, more hope, more love spreading across a world that was finally learning to see with its heart.